welcome. We are very pleased to be able to have as a partner today Dr. Jack Mayer, physician and author, and we are going to talk about his new book and many other things in this time. The book is called Before the Court of Heaven, and I would like to show that to you and then ask a big question. And the big question is, what drew you to this book, to this story? That's always a question about stories. Why and what is the story? And then the other part of that was this curiosity about your description of this as a cautionary tale. And so maybe with that, we'll let you just launch into this.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. We're pleased to be here and share this important story and this important the history behind and then the history that inspired Before the Court of Heaven. Well, let me start by just quoting George Santayana, the Spanish writer, who said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And what he's really asking us to do is to recognize echoes of painful history and to do what we can to prevent their repetition. History is cyclical, but it's never identical, and that's the problem. If history just repeated itself exactly, we'd be able to identify the recurrences. But unfortunately, it manifests in different ways when it recurs, so we need to be ever vigilant about how painful history recurs. It's also our unfortunate nature, I think, that we project evil onto others as if somehow we're not capable of it ourselves. And I think in thinking about the history of Nazi Germany, we really do so at our peril. The path that led to the Nazi dictatorship began with intolerance and fear. It went on to hatred and discrimination, and finally marginalization and murder. I'm a German Jew. I was born after the war. My parents narrowly escaped the Holocaust. Others in my family did not. I have always felt that the Holocaust has been a mission. It was the iconic story of my childhood, but that I have a mission and I didn't quite know what that was until I started writing about it and realized that that I was to be a witness to what had happened during the Holocaust and how the Nazi dictatorship came to be. My first book, Life in a Jar, The Irena Sendler Project, is about the Warsaw Ghetto. Before the Court of Heaven is about the rise of the Nazi Party and how the Nazi dictatorship came to supplant Germany's Weimar democracy. So Before the Court of Heaven covers a span of history that begins even before World War I, goes through the period of revolution after World War I, the rise of the Nazi Party into World War II and the Holocaust. So it covers a critical period of history. The title of my book, Before the Court of Heaven, really has a double meaning, and it comes from where this idea first was planted, where the seed for the book first came from. I was attending a Yom Kippur service here at Middlebury College in 1992, and the rabbi gave a sermon about this young fascist assassin, my protagonist, Ernst Teschow, who was one of the three assassins who helped to murder Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau in 1922. He was the highest-ranking Jew in the Weimar democracy. And his murder, in some sense, really was the first Holocaust murder. And I say that because that was a time when the Nazis could have been stopped, and that Nazi ideology could have been stopped. once Hitler became chancellor in 1933 and the dictatorship was established a month later, there was really not much that could be done to stop the Nazis from carrying out their agenda. But in these 20s, during the Weimar democracy, that's when Hitler and the Nazis could have been stopped. So the story that the rabbi told in his sermon was about the redemption, about the atonement and redemption of this young fascist assassin. Yom Kippur is the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. It's a day of atonement and a day when you seek forgiveness for sins against God. It's a day that people are turn from evil, redeem themselves, but that's for sins against God. Sins against your fellow human have to be confessed and atoned person to person. And so how does one do that after murdering someone? And what does that atonement look like, this redemption that must precede, that is, before the court of heaven? I started doing research. I was fascinated by this young man's story, and maybe I should start by reading a letter, because the most fascinating part of this story is the letter of forgiveness from the murdered man's mother to this young fascist assassin's mother that is the fulcrum of his redemption, of his turn from evil. And this is an actual letter that was read in court when this young man was on trial. I'm just going to read just a brief reading from here. And Dr. Hahn is Ernst's lawyer. For the first time in 2 weeks of proceedings, Frau Rathenau's chair in the gallery was conspicuously empty. Dr. Hahn adjusted his reading glasses. He began. Frau Rathenau addressed this letter to Frau Teschow on July 3rd, only 9 days after the assassination. So this is a letter from the mother of the man who was killed to the mother of the man who killed him. My dear Frau Teschow, in grief unspeakable I give you my hand, you of all women the most pitiable. Say to your son that in the name and spirit of him he has murdered, I forgive, even as God may forgive. If before an earthly judge he make a full and frank confession of his guilt, and before a heavenly one repent. Had he known my son, the noblest man earth bore, he would rather have turned the weapon on himself than on him. May these words give peace to your soul, Matilda Rathenau. The silence in the courtroom, as dense as fog on the hovel, was metered by the subtle beat of ceiling fans. A woman coughed in the shadow under the balcony. It seemed a signal for everyone to exhale at once, their breath becoming the rustle of clothes, the clearing of throats, sniffles, white handkerchiefs fluttering. Dr. Hahn folded the letter carefully, then wiped his pince nez and said, Ernst Teschow has confessed the whole truth to his earthly judges, and he will answer before his heavenly judge. I ask the court to pass judgment in the spirit of Frau Rathenau's letter. Ernst looked to the empty chair from which Frau Rathenau had presided over the court as surely as the judges. He resisted her words, but they pried into him like a thief picking the lock of his heart. So young Ernst, who's 21 at the time, takes this letter to prison with him, and it's an enigmatic letter. He doesn't understand it, but it becomes the fulcrum of his redemption. So, and the rabbi read this letter at the Yom Kippur sermon, and it touched my heart, and I started to do research on it. I very quickly found in the National Archives a microfilm transcript of this young man's arrest, his interrogation, and the court proceedings against him. And this was finding treasure for a writer, because I had his actual words. I had his actual dialogue, and the dialogue of the co-conspirators, of his brother, of his family members, to use as a basis for writing the novel. So the first part of this book really is part fiction and part nonfiction, because the details of the murder, the assassination, the trial, are all based on these transcripts. So it really hews very closely to the actual events that occurred. So I brought along some slides to show, to kind of illustrate this history, because it's the history that inspired the novel that I really want to make vivid, that I wanted to make really visceral for people. One of the challenges of writing historical fiction is that, and one of the pleasures of writing historical fiction is that it illuminates, it animates history in a way that makes it very powerful for a reader. So that if dry exposition of history is plot, I'm looking for character development to supplement the plot. And I think it is character that really gives three dimensions to this history. So if we could start with the next slide. A New York Times columnist and historian identified these four conditions that allowed for the fall of the Weimar democracy at the end of World War I: loss of trust in institutions, social humiliation, political blunders, and economic distress. So at the end of World War I, when the German army surrendered, the stab in the back myth was one of the explanations for the defeat of the German army, and it became part of Hitler's usual talking points, and it was part of the right-wing establishment's anger at the failure of the German army. And the backstabbers. So the myth was that the German army didn't lose the war. The German army was betrayed by so-called the November criminals at home. November because that's when the armistice was signed. And the so-called backstabbers, these treasonous betrayers, are intellectuals, politicians, degenerate artists, socialists, communists, Jews. The stab in the back myth inspired a populist anger that was encouraged by the right-wing establishment. And the right-wing establishment was monarchists, people who wanted to see the Kaiser Wilhelm back on the throne. They were conservative elites and wealthy power brokers, financiers, bankers. They were military officers, large estate owners, and those who ran large industries: coal, steel, construction. Next slide. This is Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau. This is the man that Ernst Teschow helped to murder on June 24th, 1922. He's the highest-ranking Jew in the Weimar Republic, and he has been the target of right-wing anti-Semitic anger. He is an assimilated Jew. He describes himself as German first and Jewish last. But it's 1922. This is 4 years after the end of the war. Germany itself is facing very difficult economic times. There's hyperinflation, there's unemployment, there's anger at the Versailles Treaty and its crushing reparations. And the stab in the back myth has become a standardly accepted explanation from right-wing parties. The other thing that's happening now is that anti-Semitism has changed after World War I. There's really a sort of a seminal change in the nature of anti-Semitism from before the war to after. For 1,000 years, the nature of anti-Semitism has basically been a religiously based. So that a 19th century German might say, I hate the Jews because of their religion. Judaism is an affront to Christianity. Jews killed Jesus. There's the blood libel, the medieval blood libel, which was that Jews make matzah from the blood of Christian children. Mm-hmm. In the post-war period, there is a racial element added to this religious bigotry. And the racial element sees Jews as genetically distinct and an inferior race, the so-called Untermensch. So a German after World War I might explain, well, I hate the Jews because they are genetically inferior as a race. Jews will interbreed and degrade the pure German race. So this racism has been reinforced by eugenic science that flourished at the turn of the century, and largely came from the United States. Much of the progress and the well, I wouldn't call it progress, but much of this sort of strange and destructive science of eugenics was developed in the United States as a response to our immigration problem at the end of the 19th century, when we had a flood of immigrants from Eastern Europe and from Italy and from Ireland, and that created a backlash, and then this eugenics movement thrived. So if I could have the next. So my protagonist, Ernst, is one of 3 assassins. The other 2 are killed in a police pursuit. Ernst is captured, put on trial, and this is a photograph taken of his trial, which occurred in October of 1922. Ernst is defendant number 2. Defendant number 6 is his younger brother, Hans Gerd, who was also a co-conspirator. And this trial was a worldwide sensation. It was in all the newspapers of the world. It is, and I should mention that. Did I talk about the transcripts? No.
No.
Okay. So in starting to do my research for this book, I came across a microfilm from the National Archives of Ernst Teschow's arrest, his interrogation, and the transcript of the entire trial, of this Organization Council trial. So this is like finding treasure for a writer. It's like finding gold, because I had my characters' dialogue. I knew exactly what happened to him. I had the dialogue of all of the co-conspirators, of his younger brother, of his other family members who were interviewed. So I had I had this raw material to work from that gave me a sense of who these characters were, what their dialogue would have been like. So this trial was a sensation, and it was really a look into the earliest manifestations of Nazism in post-war Germany. The letter from Frau Rathenau was read at the end of this trial. This is a real letter. This really happened. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom after this letter was read. It was quite a dramatic moment. So, in thinking about where do Nazis come from? Where do people aren't born murderers? They're not born Nazis. They are taught, and really, the history. And I go back to this point in my book. It begins with the indoctrination of young people, with the education of young people. And there was a movement in Germany called the Wandervogel, Wandering Birds, which was from the late 19th century and early 20th century. And it was a youth movement that dated back to this ethos of going back to nature, of freedom, of stressing Germany's heroic Teutonic roots. And it parts of this movement became militaristic, nationalistic, and virulently anti-Semitic. And Ernst belonged to this group of Wandervogel that was very right-wing and very anti-Semitic and racist. So in much the same way that the Weimar democracy became Nazi Germany, what began as an innocent German youth movement, the Vogel, became the Hitler Youth. And many of the people involved in this and in this trial and as co-conspirators also became the leaders of the Nazi Party. And so this was the training ground for them. Now, if we go forward to the end of World War I, this is a photograph of the Kiel Naval Base in 1918, in October of 1918, before the war ended. And this was, Germany made a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the war by having their substantial fleet confront the British fleet that was blockading Germany at the end in October of 1918. The fleet was ordered to action, and the sailors mutinied. It was a remarkable event that happened throughout the fleet. And at the Kiel Naval Base, at the Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, virtually all the sailors refused the order to go and fight. And they, within about a week, the red Soviet flag was flying over most ships, most of the German warships. Mm-hmm. The mutiny is successful. Mm-hmm. The war effort collapses. This is the end of October, the beginning of November, and the Weimar Republic, the German Republic, is mistakenly announced. This is a photograph that is taken at the moment that the German Republic is announced on November 9th, 2 days before the armistice is signed. At the Reichstag, there are huge demonstrations of people outside, and the German communists have started staging a revolt and an uprising to try and take over the German state and make it a Soviet republic. And the Social Democrats in the Reichstag hear a rumor that the communists are about to take over. Philip Scheidemann, deputy leader, rushes to the balcony overlooking the demonstrators and announces the creation of the German Republic. Of course, he had no authority to do this.
Did it all by himself, right?
Did it all by himself because he was afraid that the communists would declare the Soviet Republic first. Mm-hmm. So he wanted to make sure that this was going to be a democratic republic. But he gets in, and the chancellor, German chancellor, goes up one side of him and down the other and says, "How dare you do that? We haven't talked about this. This is not, you just made policy from the balcony." But it was too late because it was already declared, and the newspapers declared it. It was the German Republic. So the 2 days later, the armistice is signed. The Germany's king, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicates the throne, and Germany is now a republic. So, meantime, the mutiny is continuing, and the uprising from the sailors is continuing. And these are some photographs of the mutinous sailors at the Kiel Naval Base from November 1918. There was fighting at the base. Some people were killed in the fighting, but virtually, every battle cruiser and every military ship was taken over by these revolutionary sailors, and these were mostly communist-inspired and socialist-inspired sailors. Within about a week to a week and a half, these socialist and communist soldiers and sailors councils existed all over Germany. That's how quickly this revolution spread. Every one of these dots is where another one of these revolutionary councils was established to further the revolution and the change of Germany into a Soviet republic. So this gives you a sense of why Philip Scheidemann went onto that balcony to declare the republic. Mm-hmm. Germany was on the verge of collapse and becoming a Soviet republic. Here's the New York Times from the day after the armistice is signed, and you get a sense of how chaotic things are in Germany. The headline says, "Armistice signed, end of the war. Berlin seized by revolutionists. New chancellor begs for order. Ousted Kaiser flees to Holland." I mean, how many things can happen in one day? It's just astounding. Meantime, the uprising in the streets continues. The soldiers are joined by workers. The German communists call themselves Spartacists, and they take the name from Spartacus, the Roman slave in 72 BC who rose up against the Roman Empire. And they take to the barricades. They're well armed. Now, you have to also remember that the soldiers from the war are returning. They're returning with their guns, the Wehrmacht. The German government tries to get the Wehrmacht to resist these uprisings in the street. They call the soldiers to action against the uprising, and most of the soldiers refuse to fight. They're a defeated army. They're weary. They're tired. It's almost Christmas, and they're done. And many of them just go home. Others of them, particularly the officer corps, joins these right-wing paramilitary groups that are called the Free Corps, and these Free Corps become this mercenary army that is the only available dependable fighting force that this fledgling German government can turn to protect itself against this communist revolution. So Chancellor Ebert makes this devil's bargain with the Free Corps to fight to overturn the revolutionists, and the Free Corps take to the streets and they start fighting the Spartacists. Spartacus call for revolution. It is really the outcome is teetering in the balance as to which way Germany will go. Here's a communist rally from 1918. At one point, the Spartacists invaded the chancellery, the royal palace, the royal stables, took ministers of the Social Democratic Party hostage. There were these huge demonstrations in the street, and some of the army soldiers who were still loyal and were trying to stop these revolutions would face down against the people in the street, and the sign in the back says "Brüder nicht schießen," which means "brothers, don't shoot," imploring the soldiers not to shoot on the demonstrators. A picture of the Free Corps in action. The Free Corps were an organized, mechanized, and ruthless fighting force. There were as many as 50,000 members of the Free Corps. This is Hermann Ehrhardt, who was the leader of the Free Corps that Ernst belonged to, which was probably the most feared and vicious of the Free Corps, the Marine Brigade Ehrhardt. And he, his unit of the Free Corps and the other Free Corps, there were many Free Corps separate units and organizations, eventually did pacify Germany, and they put down the communist revolt, so that by 1919, the German government was able to gather in Weimar, Germany, and write a constitution. And this is why we call it the Weimar Republic. Weimar was chosen because it was one of the only safe cities for the delegates to gather in. They gathered in February of 1919, and they were protected by the Free Corps. And that's why the German Republic started there. So the Versailles Treaty, which can probably be considered fertilizer for World War II, was one of the harshest treaties imposed on the losers by the victors. And among its requirements was that the German army could have no more than 100,000 men, that severe reparations were demanded from the Germans. Mm-hmm. And those reparations the treaty went into effect in January of 1920. Within a year, because of the reparations, the cost of the reparations was huge, and it was really punishing, and it was meant to punish the Germans. But there was a hyperinflation then and a real recession in Germany. The hyperinflation began in earnest in June of 1921, and just to give you a sense of the dimensions of that, in 1914, 4.2 marks bought $1 US. In 1923, at the height of this hyperinflation, 4.2 trillion marks bought $1 US. Wow. So here's a photograph of children playing with worthless marks. The gentleman with the wheelbarrow is carrying enough marks to buy a loaf of bread. So if we could turn the slides off for a second, and we'll get back to George Grosz in just a moment. Okay. So where's Hitler in all of this? Because he's obviously a significant player. And I think it's important to realize that Hitler is necessary but not sufficient to cause this to happen. Because in reality, the German people chose Hitler and the Nazis. They voted for him. Hitler returns from World War I as an intelligence officer. He's assigned to keep an eye on this new party called the German Workers' Party that formed in 1919. He attends these meetings, and he finds that he's really drawn to this nationalistic, anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, anti-Marxist philosophy. It's an extreme right-wing ideology and authoritarian, and wanted the monarchy back. He's invited to join this party, even though he's the spy who's supposed to keep an eye on them, and he becomes member number 55 of the German Workers' Party. He begins working full-time for the party, and in February of 1920, the name of the party changes to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, and that's the beginning of the Nazi Party in 1920. The headquarters are in Munich, which is a hotbed of this anti-government German nationalism. In 1921, Hitler becomes the party chairman. He starts giving speeches. He gives the famous beer hall speeches that Hitler is known for. And he starts to talk about this document called the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. And this is a fabricated anti-Semitic text from Russia, which is purported to describe a vast Jewish conspiracy for global domination. Interestingly, or disturbingly, that document is now being quoted again by extreme white supremacists and neo-Nazis in the United States. It was distributed by the Nazi Party. Henry Ford in the United States printed 500,000 copies and distributed it. So there was a good deal of anti-Semitism in America as well. On the 5th anniversary of Germany signing the armistice, Hitler carries out, he attempts a coup d'etat in Munich, and this is the beer hall putsch. Putsch is the German word for coup. Hitler and 2,000 Nazis take control of parts of Munich. They're confronted by the army and the police. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen are killed, and Hitler is arrested. He goes on trial, and in his trial, he's given a platform for his beliefs. It's a 24-day trial. It's very public. He's sent to prison where he is able to dictate Mein Kampf. And the final sort of benefit that accrued to Hitler from this failed beer hall putsch was that he realizes in writing Mein Kampf and in his time in prison, he comes to the realization that the path to power is through legitimate means and rather than revolution or force. So Hitler decides at that point, when he's released from prison in 1924, that he's going to pursue a democratic means to get to power, which is what he does. Now, if we can get back to George Grosz, there's a cultural dimension to the rise of the Nazis as well, and which also encouraged the rise of the Nazis. So Germany was the birthplace of expressionism, of atonal music, of jazz, of expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, the Three-Penny Opera, Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, the Dada movement of painting, which was a very sort of disturbing anti-war art movement, and George Grosz, who was one of the prominent members of the Berlin Dada group. He was a communist. He drew biting caricatures of fat businessmen, wounded soldiers, prostitutes, sex crimes, orgies. It was a very disturbing art form for many people. Josephine Baker was popular in the Berlin nightclubs, in the cabaret scene in Berlin. She's an expatriate African-American who lived in France, and she made a big splash in Germany in the 20s, and in 1925 was on a cabaret tour in Germany. Hitler began to use these sort of cultural excesses as a propaganda tool, and in this regard he had the support of the Protestant Church, which was very eager to counter these sort of secular liberal excesses. So the 1924 to 1928 is the golden 20s in Germany. Things are going well. The economy has recovered. The inflation is over. And Germany's doing actually quite well. There are elections held. Hitler runs in these elections. His party, the Nazi Party, gets 3% of the vote in 1924. By 1928, they get 2.6% of the vote. So Hitler is a footnote. He is he's considered a dunderhead. The press calls him a pathetic fool, a dunderhead, an incompetent, a clown, and no one thinks that anything is going to come of him. But the weight that finally breaks Weimar's back is the 1929 Depression, the Great Depression. And so this is the economic distress that is one of those four elements that caused the fall of Weimar democracy. And Hitler takes full advantage of the Depression and of the distress that occurred during the Depression. In the September 1930 elections, the Nazis finish second. They get 18.3% of the vote. They're the second largest party in the Reichstag now. This is a photograph of electioneering. So they were, again, following the democratic principles of free and fair elections. The next election is 18 months later, in April of 1932. This is now the depth of the Depression. 1/3 of Germans are unemployed. Hitler now, he has the support of industrialists who are using him to further their ends. He runs for president and finishes with 37% of the vote. So he's doubled his vote now in less than 2 years, and is now a force to be reckoned with. 6 months later, in the German federal elections of November 1932, the Nazis take 33% of the seats in the Reichstag. no party is able to make to form a government, and Hitler is appointed as chancellor as in a sort of a deal that was made between the Chancellor Hindenburg and the right-wing establishment that thinks they can use him as a tool for their ends, and they also feel like, you know, he's an idiot, he's a jerk. We can manipulate him, we can use him, and we can take advantage of his base to be in power legally. So Hitler becomes chancellor in January of 1933. Incidentally, my mother grew up in Mainz, and she was 16 years old when Hitler became chancellor. And she said to me that, and when I was sort of interviewing her, because she certainly was a witness of all of this history, as was my father, who grew up in Munich. But she said, you know, in the Jewish community in Mainz, nobody was worried about her. There had been so many governments that came and went, and they would last for 6 months and disappear, that you know, people said, oh, the Nazis, just another government, just, you know, don't worry about them, they won't last, there's nothing to be concerned about. So nobody had any real concerns. Now, what changed everything, and here's really how quickly a democracy can become a dictatorship. So it's a month after Hitler became chancellor, and the Reichstag is set afire. And to this day, we don't really know who set this fire. It could have been by a lone, deranged Dutch anarchist, or by the Nazis themselves. But Hitler blames the communists, and he suspends civil liberties, begins mass arrests, uses charges of terrorism. I want to quote our fourth president, James Madison, who warned that tyranny arises on some favorable emergency. And this was the favorable emergency that allowed the Nazi dictatorship to begin. Because in the wake of the Reichstag fire, concentration camps were established. There was a decree that was passed called the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended basic rights and civil liberties. It provided for detention without trial. And all of this was still permitted by the Constitution. There was an article, Article 48, that allowed for these emergency powers in the event of an emergency, which this was. In the wake of the fire, 4,000 people are arrested right away as political prisoners. A week after the fire, there's an election. Now the Nazi Party wins 44% of the vote. 3 weeks after this election, Hitler's government brings what's called the Enabling Act to a vote in this newly elected Reichstag. And the official title of the Enabling Act was the Law to Remedy the Distress of People and the Reich. And it gave Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws, even ones that deviated from the Constitution, without the consent of the Reichstag for 4 years. So the Third Reich was born. And by the summer of 1933, there were concentration camps all over Germany. So really, that's how that transition from democracy, and we can turn the slides off at this point, how that occurred. The time to do something, the time for there to be civil unrest, for there to be a passive resistance to the Nazis, was before Hitler became chancellor and before the Reichstag fire and the dictatorship was established. Because, you know, once the dictatorship was established, there really was, it was unstoppable. But it was very stoppable in the 20s and the early 30s. And that's when people should have done something.
Was there a lack of leadership at that point?
There was, and people didn't recognize the danger that Hitler and the Nazis exemplified. And in particular, the churches did not stand up to Hitler. There was no organized statement from the pulpit against the Nazis until the mid-30s, when it was too late. 35 is when the Protestant Church had a protest against what the Nazis were doing. 37 when the Catholic Church protested, but it was too late by then. So there, the voices of opposition were not there in the 20s, and most people just thought that the Nazis were a transient phenomenon, and that they, will eventually just.
And the institutions, that was the first point in the four, really were weak at that point.
Well, the Reichstag, right. Yes, and they were. It was very similar to what's going on now in our Congress, where the polarization in the Reichstag was so extreme, and polarization of politics was so extreme that nothing could get done anymore, and people became polarized to the extreme right or the extreme left, and there was a very weak center that could not hold.
So collaboration was not a workable word, right?
Collaboration in terms of
to bring people together to.
Oh no! I mean the level of discord was extreme, and there were no conversations, no civil conversations between people, and then there was also the economic conditions when the economics were good in the late 20s, before the crash and the Depression began. People put aside their concerns about right-wing parties and about emerging fascist ideas. Mussolini was already well ensconced in Italy. These ideas were afloat. So there, again, when times are good, you don't worry about these things, and people are not concerned to do something about these sort of extreme fascist ideologies.
The humiliation was a factor that, because of the way they were treated in terms of the cost, the penalties that were imposed. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was the Versailles Treaty also put the full guilt for World War I on Germany, which, as we know, historically, there was plenty of guilt to go around. World War I was as much a war of economics as it was of anything else. So the tragedy of World War I and the blame for it, and why this happened, and the militarization, the buildup before World War I, the colonies that people were in, that nations were competing to establish, the world banking system. There was so much going on that precipitated World War I. Yet Versailles, Clause 231 in Versailles Treaty put the full blame on Germany. So there was this sort of national humiliation right there in the document that they were looking at all the time. Germany was stripped of its colonies. The reparations really represented financial humiliation to the Germans, because so much of, as they were trying to rebuild, the Allies were taking all of their money away from them, that they were, so that they really had there was so much difficulty with being able to try and rebuild their shattered economy. We learned that lesson after World War II with the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was the opposite of the Versailles Treaty. We helped the defeated Germans rebuild. Versailles tore the Germans down and humiliated them.
I remember the age that I was after the war. I didn't know much about politics. But I remember being impressed with the Marshall Plan and the idea that this was, because we had been in the whole matter of rationing, and kind of the motivation that you heard in the Midwest was we need to continue that just a little bit longer in order to help bring the democracy back to. And I just have a vague remembrance of that as being something very positive, the Marshall Plan, in terms of the war.
Yeah, yeah, and probably allowed for then the development of the United Nations and this sense of cooperation and and would then probably allow for the common market and then the EU to occur, because these nations were rebuilt, and there was a sense of economic possibility and vitality and agency among them.
As you have presented your book and had conversations, what kind of responses have you gotten in terms of people making the connection between that time and this time?
When I give this presentation, I don't talk about things that are happening now, because the echoes, the reverberations of the history are so clear to people. I mean, I must say, within 2 months of publishing my book, the election happened, and now I'm asked quite frequently to talk about this history, because it is this book has become a cautionary tale for us to understand what happened in Germany, because similar echoes of that are occurring now. And I just noticed yesterday Obama was giving a talk at the Chicago Economic Forum, and he also talked about the similarities between what happened in Weimar Germany and what's happening now in America. So this conversation has a lot of currency right now, and people are more and more realizing that we have been down this road before, and it did not end well. And we should be surveillant. We should be present about that. Two quotes I want to share with the viewers. One is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a civil rights champion. He was a friend of Martin Luther King Jr.'s, and he said of the Holocaust, "Some are guilty, but all are responsible." And I take that very seriously, that we have a response, that every silence, every deferred response is a failure of our responsibility to prevent these events from happening. We talk about bystanders. The German word for bystander is Mitläufer, and Mitläufer means fellow traveler. And it's a much more incisive conceptualization of what a bystander does, because really, in some sense, a bystander makes an accommodation with evil, allows it to go on. Now, that being said, we are all bystanders. And if we look at the litany of genocides that have occurred since World War II, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Syria, Yemen. I mean, it just goes on, and we tend to feel helpless about what we can do. But the only failure is to do nothing. Each of us can do something, even something small, that will do something to correct this history, or to repair this damaged world. And the other quote I want to share in that regard is from Rabbi Tarfon from 2,000 years ago, who said that it is not for us to finish the task, but neither are we free to desist from it. Just this sense that there is something that we all can do, every one of us can do, to promote decency, to promote tolerance, to promote respect for all people. People have said that Nazism and the Holocaust may have been unstoppable, but it should have been unbearable. And that was the failure of Weimar. It was not unbearable. By the time Hitler came to power, it was unstoppable. So we have the moment now to declare what is unbearable and to stop it from happening now.
Unbearable. That's a powerful word, and I don't know that I've heard that in the contemporary discussion. How would you raise that up?
Well, I think it's our responsibility to use words like that in identifying and naming the excesses and the that we're seeing unfolding on a daily basis, and it's this slow accretion of intolerance, of hate, of fear, of xenophobia, of nationalism, of bigotry, that allows for the it gives permission for hatred to occur, and we have to stand up and say that is fundamentally wrong. That is indecent. That is not what a community of civilized individuals do for each other. That we are in community together, and we have to declare that as unbearable when people prevent those positive connections of community from occurring and start to tear down the connections that we all have with each other.
I really, I'm pondering and feeling really blessed to have been talking to you about this, to hear.
Thank you.
I hope that more people will engage in that conversation with you, and begin to connect this to the stories that we're of what's happening in our time, and how we make it so that we stand for decency. And so I thank you for that.
Thank you for the opportunity to share this.
I think we invite those of you who are looking at this to read this book, to enter into this conversation. There are other, you are perhaps already, and in order to really look at what it is that calls for us to be present, and making sure that things do not deteriorate in our society, and we stand up for that which will be right, and for all of us, for all of the world. And this has been very helpful. And
Thank you.
we thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.